All right, welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking a look at something I think a lot of our listeners are interested in, and that's improving your English language skills.
For sure.
And we're going to be drawing on this really amazing resource for this deep dive.
Absolutely.
It's a blog post with 100 practical tips.
Wow, that's a lot.
It is. It's called 100 Helpful Tips for IELTS and ESL Students.
ESL as well.
And this comes from Hester, who's the Director of Studies over at Langports, Brisbane.
Okay, yeah.
So these are all tips that come from experience.
Yeah.
So no matter what level you're at with English, you know, whether you're just starting out or you consider yourself pretty fluent, you know, there's always room to improve.
Of course.
And this is a great way to kind of just cut through all the noise out there.
Right.
Because there's a lot of advice out there.
Yeah.
This is focusing on what really works.
Absolutely.
And, you know, it's such a variety of advice. So we're talking everything from grammar and vocabulary, which are sort of like the building blocks of English.
Right.
But also just like mindset shifts and daily habits.
Yeah.
Things that you can do to just really become better at English.
Love it.
So our goal for this deep dive is to, you know, pull out some of the most impactful advice, maybe even some surprising advice
Yeah.
from this really extensive list.
Okay.
And, you know, we want to give you things that you can take away and immediately start using.
Yeah, I like that. Actionable.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So let's just jump right into it. The first tip that Hester offers is, don't be afraid to make mistakes.
Yeah.
Be confident.
It sounds pretty basic, but I feel like people really get tripped up on this.
Right. Why is that so crucial?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because they've done studies and they've shown that students who actually try to use new language, even if they're wrong,
Right.
they make more progress.
Well, that's interesting.
Versus the students that are too scared to say anything because they might be wrong.
So it's almost like in making the mistake, you know, you're sort of alerting your brain
Totally.
to, hey, pay attention.
That's right, yeah.
This is how you do it.
It's like vital feedback,
Yeah.
you know, and it's actually how we learn anything new, not just language,
Right.
but especially language. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
And I think that also ties into, you know, the idea of creating that English-speaking environment.
Right.
So that you can sort of passively learn through active speaking,
Yeah.
you know, just by trying to use the language.
Right.
Even if you're not studying those particular elements at that moment,
Okay.
you're still absorbing it.
That makes sense. So you're getting feedback and you're also just constantly surrounding yourself with English.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. All right, now let's talk about study habits.
Yes.
So Hester talks about having a study plan, practicing daily.
Right.
She even says, tell your family and friends about your study plan.
Okay.
Why is that? Why bring your family and friends into this?
I think it's all about creating a system of accountability so that, you know, if you're telling your family and friends,
All right.
they're going to be asking you, how are you doing with your English?
Right, you've got this support network.
Exactly. Yeah.
They're going to help you to stay on track.
Right.
Interesting. Now, the blog post also draws a distinction between short-term goals.
Okay.
You know, like, let's say you have a test coming up,
Right.
and then long-term goals.
I see.
Really thinking about, you know, how's English going to improve your life?
Yeah.
So what's the value in thinking about those long-term goals?
I think that's where the real motivation comes from because, you know, a short-term goal, you can stay focused on it,
Right.
but to really fuel your efforts
Yeah.
over a long period of time,
Right.
you got to think about those long-term goals.
So you're thinking about how English is going to improve your life,
Right. Yeah.
what opportunities it's going to open up for you.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got those short-term goals to keep us on track, but then those long-term goals are the ones that are really going to keep us motivated.
Exactly.
Okay, now let's talk about the core skills of English. Reading, writing, speaking, and listening.
Yes.
And you know, obviously, it goes without saying that you got to practice all of those.
Right.
But I wanted to zoom in on vocabulary building because the blog post suggests keeping a vocabulary notebook,
Right.
but it also says to actively use new words.
Okay.
So why is that? Why isn't it enough just to write the words down?
I think it's because you're engaging different parts of your memory. So if you're writing a word down,
Right.
you know, and then maybe even writing a sentence with it, and then saying that sentence out loud a couple of times,
Right.
you're really getting all of the senses involved.
Yeah, so you're not just seeing the word.
Yeah.
You're hearing it.
Yeah.
You're saying it.
Yeah, and that helps it to stick more.
That makes sense. So it's that multi-sensory approach that really helps.
Yeah, and it's a lot different than just memorizing lists of words.
Right, which is how I remember learning vocabulary in school.
Yeah, exactly.
I would have these quizzes
Yeah.
where I had to write out the definitions.
Right.
And it was like gone the next day.
Exactly.
Yeah. So the blog post also says, to learn words in context. So through example sentences.
Yeah.
How does that help?
Well, you're understanding the nuances of the word. You're seeing how it functions in real communication.
Right.
It's not just an isolated word.
Right. Yeah.
You're actually understanding how to use it.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, recognizing that everyone learns in their own way.
Right.
Hester highlights the importance of personalized learning strategies.
Okay.
She says, know what works best for you.
Yeah, I love that.
Think about how you've successfully learned things in the past. So how can someone actually figure that out for themselves?
Well, I think you have to be really honest with yourself and look back at times where you have successfully learned things and, think about what methods you use.
Right.
And try to figure out, are you someone who remembers things best by writing them out, by reading them, by talking to people about it?
Right.
The blog post mentions various learning styles and, the importance of your study environment. Do you like to study in a quiet place by yourself or do you prefer a group environment?
Right.
The key is just to try different things out.
Right.
And pay attention to what works for you.
And be honest with yourself.
Exactly.
And I think that goes back to something that she said, which is don't be afraid to ask for help.
Yes.
If you're struggling with something, it's okay to reach out for help.
Absolutely. That's so important.
Yeah. Okay. So now let's talk about effective study techniques.
Okay.
And I feel like regular review is something that's pretty obvious to a lot of people.
Right. Yeah.
Go back and review what you've learned. But what's interesting is the blog post suggests taking breaks about every 30 minutes.
I see.
So why such short intervals?
Well, it has to do with the way our brains process information.
Okay.
If we focus for too long, we actually start to retain less.
Oh, interesting.
So those short breaks really help us to reset our focus.
Right.
And prevent mental fatigue.
I see.
And it also gives our brains time to consolidate the new material.
So it's almost like taking those breaks
Yeah.
is actually helping to cement
Totally.
that knowledge
Absolutely.
in our minds.
Yeah.
Interesting. And the blog post also advises against rushing to higher levels. Why is that?
Well, it's important to have a really solid foundation.
Okay.
So you don't want to rush ahead
Right.
and then, find yourself struggling later on because you didn't really master the basics.
So it's about, really mastering the level that you're at
Exactly.
before moving on.
Yeah.
Okay. Now let's talk about using different types of media to learn English.
Okay. Love that.
So, one of the things that Hester talks about is watching DVDs. And she suggests that they're good for repeated viewing
Right.
compared to, let's say watching TV. So why is that? Why is that ability to rewatch something so important?
I think that's all about deeper comprehension.
Okay.
So when you watch something multiple times, you're really able to pick up on the nuances of the language.
So you can maybe focus on pronunciation one time,
Yeah.
focus on certain vocabulary another time,
Totally.
or maybe even just, kind of get a feel for the rhythm and intonation of the language.
Right. Absolutely.
And TV, on the other hand, you're just sort of getting one exposure. So it's more suited for those who are at a higher level, who are just kind of trying to maintain their English,
Yeah.
or maybe practice in a more spontaneous setting.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, she also recommends reading graded readers
Okay.
and children's books.
I like that. That's a good idea.
So, I think some people might feel that that's too basic for them.
Right.
Why read something that's for kids?
Yeah.
But what's the value in using these simpler texts?
Well, I think it all comes down to comprehensible input.
Okay.
So if you're reading something that's too difficult, you're not really going to learn anything.
Right.
You're just going to get frustrated.
Right.
So, graded readers and children's books are specifically designed for people learning English. So the vocabulary is going to be manageable.
Right.
The grammar is going to be manageable.
Yeah.
And it's a great way to just build your confidence and improve your overall comprehension.
And I think the other thing with children's books is they often have pictures
Yeah,
So it can kind of help you to understand the meaning, even if you don't know every single word.
totally. Absolutely.
And Hester also recommends something that I thought was really interesting,
Yep.
which is to look for the passive voice in newspapers.
Mm-hmm.
Have you heard of this before?
No, I haven't.
Yeah. So this is a specific exercise
Oh, I see.
that you can do to really get a handle on the passive voice,
Okay.
which can be really tricky for learners of English,
Right.
but it's a way to kind of see it in action.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, when it comes to reading, more challenging materials, the blog post suggests that you read for the general meaning first,
Okay.
and only then go back and look up unfamiliar words.
I see.
And I feel like a lot of people would kind of feel like that's backwards.
Yeah, I could see that.
Like, shouldn't you know what all the words mean first?
Right.
But what's the benefit of reading for the general meaning first?
Well, I think it helps you to develop reading fluency.
Okay.
So if you're constantly stopping to look up words,
Right.
you're never really going to get into the flow of the text.
Right.
So if you just try to get the general meaning first, you can go back later and look up the words that you don't know.
Right.
But you're not going to lose the thread of what you're reading.
And you're not going to get discouraged
Exactly.
by all those unfamiliar words.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, if you wait to look up the word, you have the context of the sentence
Right.
to help you understand it.
Totally.
So you might be able to figure out the meaning without even having to look it up.
Absolutely.
The blog post also talks about this really useful technique for vocabulary building,
Okay.
which is learning root words, prefixes,
Prefixes. Okay.
suffixes.
Suffixes.
So how does that help you with your vocabulary?
Well, I think it helps you to see patterns in words.
Oh,
So if you know that scrib means write, then you can figure out words like scribe,
right.
script,
Mm-hmm.
prescription.
Exactly.
Exactly. Or if you know that min means small, you can figure out words like minute, miniature,
Okay.
minimal.
And then prefixes and suffixes.
Yeah.
Those are kind of like little add-ons to words
Exactly.
that can change their meaning.
Yeah.
So like means not.
Right.
So happy, unhappy,
Right.
and then suffixes like illy often make an adjective into an adverb.
Right. Yeah.
So quickly, that
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Totally.
So, if you can break down the words into their parts, it becomes a lot easier to figure out what they mean.
Absolutely.
Okay, cool. Now let's talk about pronunciation,
All right.
which can be a really tricky area for English language learners.
Yeah.
The blog post mentions word stress in English, and it contrasts English with languages like Japanese or French.
Okay.
So how is word stress different in English?
So in English, the placement of stress within a word can completely change its meaning.
Oh, wow.
Or its grammatical function. Whereas, in other languages like French, each syllable might have a more equal weight.
Right.
But in English, we emphasize certain syllables.
Right.
And that emphasis is key to being understood clearly.
So it's not just about pronouncing the sounds correctly.
Right. Exactly.
It's also about stressing the right syllable.
Totally.
Okay. And the blog post gives this kind of like basic rule of thumb for two-syllable words.
Okay.
It says that verbs tend to stress the second syllable, and nouns and adjectives tend to stress the first.
Okay.
So, for example, the word present. If you're talking about a gift,
Yeah.
it's present.
Right.
But if you're talking about giving something to someone, it's present.
That's right. That's a great example.
Yeah. So it can really change the meaning of the word.
Absolutely.
All right. Now, Hester also mentioned something called shadowing.
Oh, yeah.
And she recommends shadowing English CDs, or maybe even reading aloud with mirror CDs. So what are those and how does that work?
So shadowing is when you listen to someone speaking English and you try to repeat what they're saying
Okay.
at the same time.
So you're basically mimicking
Yeah, exactly.
the speaker.
Yeah, you're mimicking their pronunciation,
Okay.
their intonation,
Right.
their rhythm.
And then what about mirror CDs?
So mirror CDs are similar, but you're reading aloud from a text
Okay.
and you're trying to match the pace and the intonation of the speaker on the CD.
So it's almost like you're having a conversation with the CD.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And it's a great way to get feedback on your own pronunciation and intonation.
Okay. And then the blog post also suggests recording yourself speaking English, which can be kind of awkward.
Yeah.
But what's the benefit of doing that?
Well, you can identify any pronunciation or intonation issues that you're not aware of.
So when we hear ourselves speaking, it can be very different
Totally.
from how we think we sound.
Yeah, and it's really helpful to be able to hear yourself objectively.
Okay, now let's talk about a specific sound in English
Okay.
that the blog post describes as the most common vowel sound in English.
Okay.
This is the schwa sound.
The schwa, I love that sound.
So can you explain what that is and why it's so important for English language learners?
So the schwa is that unstressed neutral vowel sound.
Okay.
It's like a relaxed like the A in about
Okay.
or the U in supply.
I see.
And because English has so many unstressed syllables in words and sentences, the schwa sound appears all the time.
Okay.
So it's really important for learners to be able to recognize it,
Okay.
both in terms of understanding spoken English and also in terms of producing it themselves.
Okay.
So if you can master the schwa, your English is going to sound much more natural and fluid.
Okay, that makes sense. Now let's talk about the connection between thinking and communicating in English. So the blog post really stresses the importance of trying to think directly in English
Right.
rather than constantly translating from your native language.
Right, yeah.
So that sounds like a big mental shift. How can someone start to do that?
Well, you have to start small.
Okay.
So try to formulate simple sentences in your head in English, even if they're basic.
Right.
And, Hester actually suggests talking to yourself in English,
Okay.
which might sound a little crazy,
Right.
but it can be really helpful.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense.
Yeah.
You're just practicing.
Exactly.
Getting those thought patterns going in English.
Yeah. And the more you practice, the easier it will become.
And the blog post makes this analogy to learning to drive,
Oh, yeah.
which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah.
Like you can read the instruction manual, but until you actually get behind the wheel and start driving, you're not really going to learn how to drive.
Right.
It's the same with English.
Yeah, you got to just do it.
You just got to do it.
Yeah.
And the blog post also makes this point about grammar, often being naturally acquired through speaking.
Yeah.
So that's kind of encouraging.
Yeah.
You don't have to memorize all the grammar rules,
Right.
just by speaking.
Yeah.
And listening to English, you'll start to absorb the grammar.
Yeah. And make those connections.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about writing.
Okay.
So the blog post gives a range of advice for improving your writing skills.
Okay.
Everything from keeping a personal English diary to launching an online blog.
Oh, wow. That's a big leap.
It is.
Yeah.
So what do you think about those two different approaches?
Well, I think keeping a diary is a really good way to just practice writing without any pressure. It's just for you. You can write about whatever you want.
Yeah.
You don't have to worry about anyone judging you.
Right, right.
Start small. Maybe just write a few sentences each day.
Okay.
And then, gradually increase the amount you write over time.
And then a blog is a very different experience
Yeah, definitely.
because you have an audience. So how does that change things?
Well, it can be really motivating
Okay.
to know that other people are going to be reading what you write.
Right, right.
And it can also give you an opportunity to get feedback on your writing
Right.
from native speakers
Okay.
or other English language learners.
So it's a good way to kind of put yourself out there
Yeah,
and get some real world feedback.
absolutely.
And then the blog post also talks about this process for improving your writing. So you start by brainstorming your ideas,
Okay.
then you structure them logically.
Okay.
You write your first draft,
Right.
and then you proofread your work. And I love that the blog post emphasizes punctuation
Yeah.
with this really kind of funny example
Okay.
about the importance of punctuation.
Okay.
So it says, a woman without her man is nothing
Right.
versus a woman without her man is nothing.
That's great. Yeah.
So it's just a funny way to kind of show how punctuation can really change
yeah,
the meaning of a sentence.
absolutely.
Okay, now let's talk about actively immersing yourself in the English language.
Okay. Love it.
So one of the things the blog post suggests is learning English songs and singing along.
Yeah.
So how does that help you learn English?
Well, I think it's a fun way to improve your vocabulary,
Okay.
your pronunciation, and your understanding of English rhythm and intonation.
Yeah.
Music is really powerful.
Yeah.
It can help us to learn and remember things.
Yeah, absolutely.
And who doesn't love singing along to a good song?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like a sneaky way to learn English.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the blog post also suggests finding a pen pal or using online chat rooms and forums.
Okay.
So what are the benefits of doing those things?
I think it's all about practicing your communication skills
Okay.
in a real world setting.
Right.
So if you're talking to a pen pal or you're chatting online, you're using English in a natural way. You're not just doing grammar exercises or memorizing vocabulary lists.
Yeah.
You're actually communicating.
And the blog post also mentions dictation exercises. Expert speaker.